I mean, seriously, do you need it made any clearer? His company is literally called White Power. He's pretty much spoon-feeding the metaphor to you. Come one, come all, my bright and risen angels. It is a damn good day to be literate because I have discovered the inimitable William Tanner Vollmann. How I made it this long without discovering the man's work is truly a marvel of nature, because this is the kind of author that seems purpose-built to my particular literary sensibility. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Welcome to episode 3 of Waste Mailing List. As always, I'm your host Seth, and I'd like to start off by saying I do apologize in the delay since my last video. With everything that's been going on this month with group reads, review copies, a couple of podcast appearances, I've just been a little bit slack when it comes to the video content. But we're here now. Like I said before, I'm willing to make a sacrifice in posting consistency in the effort to try and create at least what I hope is more substantive content. Mercifully for you, I don't have much in the way of a preamble today. I would be remiss, of course, if I didn't thank all of you for taking the time out to watch my previous video on animal money. The recognition I received from both you as an audience and even the author himself was just as affirming as the response I got to the first video. So as always, thank you so much for your attentive, open-minded viewership. It truly justifies all the effort that goes into this. This was not meant to be episode 3, or even 4. If you listen to my interview on Beyond the Zero, shameless self-promotion I know, you may have been expecting a different video for today.
What are you looking at covering in the future?
I'm working on a video of Bat City by Leonard Gardner right now.
That episode is still in the works. I'm just going to take a little more time to gestate on it and formulate my thoughts before I put it out for public consumption. As I alluded to up top, I was immediately and profoundly taken by Vollmann's work. And regrettably, there's really little critical or appreciative content toward the man on YouTube. Chris V is doing a fantastic job of championing Vollmann's work. I'll link to it up top here. But aside from him, reviews and analysis of his novels are few and far between. So I figured I'd try my hand at offering my own freshly initiated take. As I'm sure the length of today's episode has already made apparent, this one is going to be on the longer side. I really went down the rabbit hole with this one. So this video contains sections on companion works, Vollmann's professional history, critical responses, and a fairly comprehensive analysis of plot, character, and themes. If you want to skip some of the extra textual stuff, I would encourage you to skip forward to section 5, the cartoon, which gets really directly into the content of the book itself. If you're after just the deeper thematic analysis of the book on the whole, section 10, Cowboys and Indians, is where you'll find it. And if you're considering reading it for the first time and want to go in cold, then section 11, recommendations, is actually where I'd suggest you start. I realize that the length of this episode may be a high barrier of entry for some of you, and so I would encourage you to split it over multiple sittings. Please don't hesitate to do so. If you would rather read or listen to today's episode, I've also included links below to the text transcript and the audio-only version of today's episode. All right, onward. Let's start by giving credit where it's rightfully due. If I could credit one singular source to my discovery of Vollmann, it would undoubtedly be the VOLLMANNIA podcast. Haven't heard of it? Let's fix that. VOLLMANNIA is the new author-centric show hosted by two stellar members of the book appreciation and critical community, Jordan Rothacker and Ryan Alexander. I've been in touch with these guys for a while now, and I was ecstatic to hear about the release of their new project. We should count ourselves exceptionally privileged to have two minds as sharp as these providing long-form critical and analytical content on the entirety of Vollmann's catalog.
And so it's a novel about the failure to express something, to live up to our heroes, to capture this kind of real-world meeting, what we have the limitations to do.
As of this recording, they've just released their first episode on an Afghanistan picture show. By the time this video goes live, they may have already released their second episode on, uncoincidentally, You Bright and Risen Angels. Ryan and Jordan, if you happen to be watching this, I hope you don't think I'm stepping on your toes by releasing an episode near to your own. I don't ever want you to think of me as a competitor, just another ardent fan, albeit far less well-read than yourselves. If you haven't listened to the show yet and have even a cursory interest in Vollmann, I would highly encourage you to do so. I'll put a link to it in the description box below. Give that first episode a listen. It's worth your time. Suffice it to say, I have these two to thank for spurring my interest in Vollmann, and hopefully yours too. Prior to encountering the VOLLMANNIA podcast, I really only had a loose name recognition of Vollmann, which is surprising to me because he spent his life trafficking in the same literary circles I consider my own personal canon, for lack of a better word. My understanding, and this is open to correction, is that he's been friends with the likes of Wallace, Franzen, Richard Powers, those guys for years now. People have even gone so far as to call him a literary heir to Thomas Pynchon. Is that a fair comparison? We'll get to that. As a brief digression, we really ought to start a drinking game on this channel. Here's the first rule. Every time I mention the name Pynchon, you take a shot. I guarantee you'll have a solid buzz on by the end of today's episode. Does that make me a comparative one-trick pony? I'll leave that for you to decide. Disregarding my own delayed discovery of Vollmann, I was incredibly surprised to see how niche his readership is. And that's in spite of what I would consider a very broad appeal. Like I mentioned earlier, he receives very little acclaim on the online literary appreciation communities. Bookstagram, Book Talk, BookTube, whatever portmanteau you want to use here. He gets the occasional mention here or there, but nowhere near to the degree that I would expect for someone of his literary caliber. While Goodreads is by no means an exhaustive population sample of an author's audience, I do think it can provide a basic metric for who is and isn't reading a particular author's work. When browsing his profile on Goodreads, I see his most well-read book has only a little over 2,000 ratings on it, and his least is less than 50. That is shocking to me, considering the depth of his prosaic skill, the breadth of his narrative and thematic interests, and just his sheer output. People have called this guy a Pez dispenser of 1,000-page novels, and that is absolutely true. We're talking 27 titles to his name and counting, many of which go well over the 1,000-page mark. Regardless of his audience, let's talk about the man himself within the context of the writing of You Bright and Risen Angels, because I think the story as to how this book came to be is worth telling itself. If you're a well-established Vollmann fan already, you can probably take a guess at the story I'm about to tell, so if this is old news for you, just give it a skip. After returning from Afghanistan in the late 80s, after the series of events that would comprise his first book, An Afghanistan Picture Show, Vollmann took a job as a computer programmer in a small San Francisco-based technology park that would later become known as Silicon Valley. I'm sure you're familiar with it. During his time working there, he would stay late in his office cubicle until everyone else had gone home, then hide under his desk while the janitors cleaned the office building, and then once the building was entirely vacant, that's when he would get to the real work. These were the conditions under which he wrote You Bright and Risen Angels. See, this was the mid-'80s, when personal computers weren't the taken-for-granted dime-a-dozen conveniences that we all have access to on a daily basis. Vollmann was forced by necessity to write this novel on his office computer. And he had to do it under the cover of night so that his bosses and supervisors wouldn't find out about his clandestine creative project. He would stay up at all hours of the night, subsisting on whatever the vending machine had to offer him, and then catching a few hours of sleep each night in a sleeping bag, tucked under his desk, behind a garbage bin. God, if that's not commitment to one's craft, I don't know what is. Honestly, I have no idea to what degree this story is apocryphal, but if there's anyone I could see doing this, it would have to be Vollmann. The plot of Angels itself does actually reference this story of how it was written in a kind of metafictional way. More on that in a bit. So that does lend credence to its authenticity. For the sake of my faith in the eccentricity of artists, I choose to believe the myth. The story becomes even more remarkable when you look at the finished product that he produced under these conditions. This isn't some slim, timid attempt to establish an authorial voice. This is an author who seemingly burst from the womb, fully formed and assured of himself as a writer of maximalist megafiction. Megafiction? Metafiction? We're talking over 600 pages of densely packed, convoluted cyberpunk revisionist history. Now, if I'm losing you with this particular characterization, I'd encourage you to just disregard all the cultural baggage that's tied up in terms like cyberpunk, and just remember the malleability and subjectivity of genre signifiers. These same terms have been applied to people like Burroughs and Pynchon, so whatever image you have in your head right now is probably not what the reality of this book actually is. I dug up a great article from The New Republic which spoke about the publication of You Bright and Risen Angels. Anyone who's taken a lot of creative writing classes or taught creative writing has learned to dread a certain kind of manuscript. It's long, for one thing. It is irritatingly small type. It's grammatically meticulous when it comes to everything but punctuation, for which it has developed its own system of Tolkienic elaboration. An unagented manuscript of roughly this description landed on the desk of Esther Whitby, an editor at the British house Andre Deutsch in 1985. Rather than do the sensible thing and reject it, Whitby went ahead and published You Bright and Risen Angels, Vollmann's bizarre fantasia of insect war. Vollmann should consider himself lucky he had Whitby for a beta reader, because this book has a surprisingly high barrier to entry. It's a dense 650 pages, the first 150 of which tell an alternative history of electricity in America. But once again, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'd also like to orient you early on about my word choice in this video. If I use the term the author, I'm referring to a character in the book. If I want to refer to Vollmann himself, I'll use his name. The reasons for this will become clear in a moment. I read the 1988 Penguin reprint of You Bright and Risen Angels. As I alluded to above, it was originally published in 1987 by Andre Deutsch, with a very young, leather-clad Vollmann covering the entire reverse cover of the book. First editions of the novel are surprisingly accessible these days. You can usually pick one up for under $100, often with a signature to boot. Regardless of the edition that you choose to read, the purpose of this section is really just to give you a sense of orientation of what to expect when you crack the book open for the first time. The dedication reads, "For Paul Foster, true friend." I went trawling around for some insights as to who Paul Foster was, but I came up completely dry. So if there are any more learned Vollmann scholars watching this, feel free to drop me a line in the comments section below about what you think this particular dedication may have meant. The first of many epigraphs reads, "Only the expert will realize that your exaggerations are really true." This is attributed to Kimon Nicolaides, a Greek-American author and art teacher, from his book, The Natural Way to Draw. I don't think I'm stepping out on a limb by suggesting this has both practical and thematic relevance to the book, given the number of bizarre and fantastic line drawings by Vollmann himself peppered all throughout the novel. The next extra-textual attribution is from Vollmann himself in the form of another dedication. This book was written by a traitor to his class. It is dedicated to bigots everywhere. Ladies and gentlemen of the black shirts, I call upon you to unite, to strike with claws and kitchen pokers, to burn the grubworms of equality's brood with sulfur and oil, to huddle together whispering about the silverfish in your basements, to make decrees in your great solemn, rotten assemblies concerning what is proper, for you have nothing to lose but your last feeble principles. Without digging too deeply into this one right now, all I'll say at this point is, damn. He's giving Mario Savio's speech at Sprue Hall a run for its money. Next you'll find a social gazette of personalities interviewed for this book. This is effectively a character list featuring all the key players in the novel, as well as their allegiances and affiliations, for which I will mention there are many. Here's an example. Our hero, Bug. Atheist, spy, revolutionary, one-time insect ally, founder of the Kuzbuit movement, aged 44 in year 1 of the revolution, university graduate. My suggestion to you is to bookmark or tab this page, as I found myself referencing and referring to it repeatedly. By my count, there are over 40 characters who play a major role in this story. I can't speak for you, but I know my memory is far from eidetic, so I found it a very convenient reference point to constantly have at hand. What follows is a transcendental table of contents. Now, do not ever accuse me of not doing anything for you guys, because I did the oh-so-tedious task of counting up the chapters in this book. It's broken down into 14 sections, and if my arithmetic is to be trusted, 227 named chapters, each one with an epigraph. Kind of. We'll get to that. There's a part of me that thinks Vollmann might just be showing off a little bit with all these epigraphs. There's clearly some scholarly dick swinging going on here and trying to show you just how widely he's read. We're talking quotes from Child of the Storm, Thomas Edison's notebooks, St. Basil's letters to the Bishop of Nicopolis, the American Handy Boy's notebook, Army field manuals, the novels of Jean-Paul Sartre. The list goes on. You could just accept at face value that these references to obscure and fringe works are properly attributed, or you could exercise your caution and recognize their dubious authenticity. Do the suspicious origins of these quotes serve a higher thematic function? We'll see. Now, there's no way in hell I'm going to list off all of those chapters for you, but I will give you an overview of all the 14 main sections. Shapeshifting, a history of electricity, the earplugs, the arming of the Great Republic, reactionaries forever, shapeshifting, the real identity of Captain Freiheit, the reign of the bugs, in the office, the little match seller, annals of the bugs, the labors of Wayne, the big fence, the mausoleum, shapeshifting, the fulfillment of all intentions. Now, if you're following along closely, you may have noticed the pagination drops off after section 6. That's no accident. That's what makes this a transcendental table of contents. See, despite the hundreds of additional named chapters beyond the second shapeshifting interlude, these chapters don't actually exist. Over half of the novel is technically unwritten, and I think the reason for this formal conceit is open to interpretation. But I'll save that for later in the video. And in reading all this, you might be thinking to yourself, what the hell is this book even about? I think it's high time we got there. You Bright and Risen Angels is a decidedly multi-layered book. Put simply, it's the story of an alternative history of America in the century following the invention of electricity. While electricity represents the focus of the majority of the power struggles in the novel, the actual conflict itself is between the armed forces of the American Republic and an indigenous race of sentient humanoid aliens that have lived on the continent long before they arrived. This should be ringing allegorical alarm bells right from the jump. But let's backtrack. The opening quarter or so of the book details in frustratingly non-linear fashion the series of circumstances that led to the discovery and widespread dissemination of electricity across America. Only it's not quite the America we're all familiar with. See, in Vollmann's world, the main political affiliations aren't separated into, red and blue, Democrat and Republican. The forces of the novel, at least the human ones, are separated into reactionaries and revolutionaries. Look, it would not be a stretch to draw comparisons between this reactionary-revolutionary divide and America's current political party systems. But to do so would be getting into very dicey territory, and I'm really not interested in hosting an argument in the discussion section below. So I'm going to let you draw your own interpretations as to who's who here. Let's start with the reactionaries. This group is led by the insipid colonial tycoon Mr. White, aptly named. White is responsible for the majority of the power generation in the American West and holds a monopoly over the electrification of the entire country. Think of him as like a jingoist analog to Thomas Edison, but with a hysterically xenophobic bend. He works very closely with the polymath Renaissance man, Dr. Dodger, who we'll be getting into in detail in a later section. The other major group vying for power are the countercultural analogs, the revolutionaries, led by the alleged hero of the story, Bug, aptly named as well. He operates as a sort of eco-terrorist resistance leader and eventually joins forces with the third major power group in the book, the insects. Vollmann may have labeled him as the hero of the story, but I don't think his socio-political sympathies lie on either side of this conflict. I view him much more as a dispassionate cultural anthropologist of the era. Despite the constant conflicts between the reactionaries and the revolutionaries in the book, the insects also provide a major source of opposition. They're a species of large humanoid creatures that appear to have existed long before the American colonists ever showed up in the country. Throughout the novel, Vollmann depicts a bloody history of interspecies genocide, persecution, and exploitation. Stay with me here. There's a fourth, more nebulous power force that exerts the clearest sense of control over the entirety of the world of angels, the blue globes. For all the obfuscation and vagueness that surrounds them, these blue globes appear to be a species of pure, concentrated electrical power, complete with consciousness, intelligence, and insidious intent. Mr. White, being the imperial technocrat that he is, views the blue globes in an exploitative light, as a resource. He and his reactionary forces seek to exert control and dominion over these blue globes in order to further extend their electrical control over the entirety of the country. So let's recap. Reactionaries, revolutionaries, insects, blue globes. These four forces are in a constant interplay of violent conflict, forming shaky alliances that fall apart just as soon as they form, exploiting one another with double and triple agents constantly intersecting and ingratiating themselves among the various groups. What we're given on the whole is a kind of bohemian oral history of the country in the years leading up to an all-out war between humans and insects, with electricity positioned as a tool of power and control the entire time. In my first video, I described a system of conflict in The Melancholy of Resistance. In Krasznahorkai's ontology, everything exists on a spectrum of that which resists and that which opposes resistance. I think that same spectrum can be applied to angels. Part of my intention behind the Waste Mailing List project is to curate a selection of books that share a lineage of thematic and narrative concerns. The interplay between oppression and opposition represents a key theme that's been present in all of the books that I've covered so far. The reactionaries resist the Blue Globe's desire for ultimate power, both figuratively and literally, by exerting control over them, and the revolutionaries oppose this control through violent uprising, that which resists and that which opposes resistance. A melancholy of resistance could be applied here when we realize that all of their collective fates have already been sealed. Fatalism is a dominant theme present in this book. When I first gave a broad description of the plot, I referred to it as a book of layers. Some people may be inclined to give it a more academic designation and refer to it as a frame narrative. Fair play to you. See, the author of this story isn't actually giving a factual retelling of American history, but rather constructing a program. Let me explain. The first proper chapter of the book, Synthetic Cognitions a priori, which is part of the History of Electricity Overture, starts off in the following way. "Oh, you bright and risen angels, you are all in your graves. I, your author, am lonely. There is no one left in the world. Since I run things here half the time, I'm going to call you up for another of my meaningless judgments. Meaningless because you are all so eager and try so hard, and I could never punish any of you, no matter how villainous you may be. I press the resurrection button, and here you come, as large as life. This is the first of many frame narrative interjections where we're slowly led to an understanding of what is actually going on here. What we're actually reading is a sophisticated piece of software written by an unnamed programmer. As he says in the opening lines, he's the only one left in the world. Or is he? And he's lonely and has played this game, his program, many, many times before. This suggests that perhaps some indeterminate apocalypse has occurred, leaving only him and his computer terminal the last remaining artifacts of a destroyed world. Whether or not this is actually the case remains unanswered, at least until the final chapters of the book. To quell the loneliness of his solitary existence, the programmer presses the resurrection button, bringing back to life all the key players in the book, and making it apparent from the very beginning the fate that awaits all of them. Death. Bug, Mr. White, Wayne, Parker, Dr. Dodger, they all rise from the dead and begin their stories again, with their fates already sealed into the program. The degree of control to which the author is able to exert his influence over this story is intentionally unclear. He makes broad assurances in the beginning that he is the one controlling the progression of the narrative. And what is clear fairly early on is he has a vested interest in the success of the revolutionaries. But what we come to realize as the story unfolds is there's more to it than just him determining the outcome of the story as it progresses onward. I will be especially faithful for these first few pages, since in beginning the story, I cannot but be reminded that every keystroke I make upon my typewriter may be transmitted through the wall outlet just behind my head, for I do not pretend to understand electricity, for I do have my own goals, both long-range and intermediate, and I am confident that my presence here makes some difference. The use of a computer program is fairly unconventional, at least in literary fiction, but at the time, Vollmann considered it the perfect sort of petri dish to explore the ethical and moral themes he wanted to really get into with this book. What You Bright and Risen Angels turned out to be was a monograph on certain experiments conducted in my ethical laboratory. Experiments involving the most powerful reagent, cruelty. Think of this program, or cartoon, as a sort of anthropological simulation wherein the characters are programmed into this sandbox environment, set free, and allowed to interact with each other in whatever way they see fit. Within this program, we witness the nuances of identity politics, groupthink, and violent conflict as these characters roam through the open world, forming allegiances and conflicts and splinter groups in and among one another. And the implication in these opening lines is that this simulation has been run before, many, many times. The novel we're reading is just one permutation of that original source code. The author explicitly alludes to this in the chapter titled Station Identification. The keys of my typewriter depress themselves and clack madly, like those of a player piano. Like, more appropriately still, since we are in the age of electricity, a teletype machine in some computer center at 3 in the morning with the lights glaring steadily down, failed programs in the wastebasket, and punch cards on the floor. What this station identification sequence also reveals is that the author has another nefarious force to contend with while writing the program, or cartoon. It should be uncoincidental that Vollmann chose the role of a computer programmer for the narrator of his novel, given that that's the job that he was employed as while writing the book. This is a rare example of metafiction done right, but be mindful as we lapse into my own personal opinions here. I usually bristle at novels that draw attention to their own artifice, as I find it really doesn't offer much in the way of broader thematic insights and often just results in my loss of immersion in the story. Whereas here, I think Vollmann takes a clever and unconventional approach to the concept of history as a subjective construction by showing us right from the jump that what we're reading is a story, a program, a cartoon, created, filtered through the mind and opinions and perspectives of a single person, or persons. We're getting there. Is it a depiction of events that led up to the programmer being the only person left in the world, or simply the thought experiment of a man and his computer with all the time on his hands that he could possibly want? Vollmann very cleverly leaves this open to interpretation. Allow me to convolute the story even further, because there's a character who bears significant impacts on the plot who I haven't mentioned yet. The very first pages of the book, from the section titled Shape-Shifting, are told from the perspective of a being that refers to itself as Big George. Big George is an anomalous force, a character who can seem to move at will through the various metatextual and historical layers of the novel. On the one hand, he alleges to be a supervisor to the programmer, the author himself, but also one of the key players within the program, the cartoon. He pops up at various points in the American colonial history, from the early days of settlement in the West, and all the way up into the days leading directly to the Revolutionary War that ignites between humans and insects in the latter half of the book. And this implies some degree of immortality. Now who could that be, I suggest, but Big George? And who could he be but pure electrical consciousness itself, insinuating itself everywhere, drifting in and out of all stories and machines? The nature of Big George is made hazy from the beginning, by design. He's described as pure electrical consciousness that can seemingly exert his will over any aspect of the program, the characters, even the author himself. What we can say with some degree of certainty is that he is the physical manifestation of pure electrical power. This is not an arbitrary elemental distinction, as electricity bears significant thematic and narrative relevance to the book at large. He claims that I may disguise myself as any other animate or inanimate object in what follows. And what we see in the book as a whole is both he and the author are constantly fighting for narratorial control, interrupting and interjecting one another, correcting each other's work. It's a classic unreliable narrator trope, but just taken to the nth degree. The author will often dial out of the program and wax lyrical about his resentment toward Big George because effectively they operate as antagonists to one another. All across the room, the other programmers rest their heads in their arms as Big George dictates to them as well, garbage in and garbage out, screwing up everything with his little spots of fun, refusing to drowse in the spurious closure of a third-person narrative. The author clearly hates Big George and his constant undercuttings of his attempts to favor the outcome of the revolutionaries. He cries out in helplessness as Big George modifies and corrupts the final program, leading us to this understanding that what we thought was complete control in the author's hands is not actually the case at all. My bright and risen angel, though I want the story to come out happily, it will not, and Catherine will fall down and die. Can you understand that? She will die, and our hero will die, because though I pound at my keys, trying to type in reformat program, command 25, save Catherine after all, please, I beg you, save Catherine, it will do no good, because such writing is a big fake that doesn't even show up on the roll of blue-lined computer paper. Only what Big George vomits out of his hard heart is what stains the story, and even my skilled skull is full of it. Big George makes a habit of constantly lying to the reader, confusing them with discrepancies in places, names, and dates. The outcome is a constant tug-of-war between unreliable narration and confabulation told from a supposedly authentic author and an omniscient, all-powerful being that floats through the story, corrupting its legitimacy along the way. And it's important to orient yourself to this conceit very early on. The constant changing of narrators and perspectives and interstitials will come as very disorienting if you don't. At least that was my experience. First time I was reading it, I got 100 pages in and realized I really didn't understand who Big George was, who the author was, if they were the same person. I ended up having to go back and read the entire thing again up until that point, and slowly. so consider this my PSA to you. For all its experimental and metafictional mechanics going on at the level of prose and structure and narrative, You Bright and Risen Angel seems like it should be a fairly straightforward good versus evil picaresque adventure. We're presented with an outsider hero, the aptly named Bug, who grows into a revolutionary leader commanding the forces of an uprising against the evil imperial armies. Come on, this is Vollmann. There's no way it's that simple. Bug starts his story with a childhood at summer camp where he experiences brutality at the hands of other campers toward both himself and the insects there. It's never made entirely clear to what degree the humans and the insects interact with and live with one another, but evidently there is some degree of ingratiation between the two groups because we see insects and kids both attending the same summer camp. And this sequence lays the groundwork for Bug choosing to align himself with the plight of the insects. Vollmann realizes that people aren't made in a vacuum and endeavors to create a portrait of a person who is traumatized into allying himself with a subjugated class of people. Physical and psychological torment are the valence through which Bug's worldview is colored. As soon as the parents drove off, the new arrivals were surrounded by the boys and taken into the woods for assimilation. Soon, there came terrible screams. But when they returned, now fast friends with their erstwhile tormentors, they grinned slyly. Never again would they be hurt. This sequence is important for a number of reasons. It establishes an in-group, out-group dichotomy that persists all throughout the novel, and also shows the brutality, unspoken as it may be in this scene, that the dominant force will exert over the weaker or vulnerable people in order to assimilate them into their group. The summer camp cliques that form here are essentially the prototype for what would eventually develop into the reactionary-revolutionary divide that comprises the bulk of the book. When it's made clear that Bug won't assimilate into this popular group, they effectively bully him and torment him all summer long and leading into his adolescent years. What this trauma instills in Bug is a violent, defensive skepticism of both power and people. In truth, people were not so nice to Bug, which was why he became a murderer. For in later life, he judged people too quickly and usually assigned them evil, negative ratings, because most cases were ambiguous, and he had been hurt so many times that he did not give ambiguous cases the benefit of the doubt, so he killed them. His childhood of both witnessing and experiencing dominant caste abuse effectively lays the groundwork for a character archetype to develop. This could have led to a simple story of revolutionary triumph over the forces of tyranny, but Vollmann complicates it by showing us that for all his resistance, Bug has actually implicitly absorbed much of that fascist mindset and responds back to his aggressors in the only way that he's been taught, through violence. When he saw how much power a little air and water could have, he decided to become a revolutionary. Riding the streetcars in the morning, he took to musing not of what was under the skirts that pressed against him, but of maps, campaigns, skyscrapers and alleyways becoming for him mysterious and melancholy, like the forests at summer camp echoing with weird promises, the large cities ripe for terrorism and leadership. Bug's moral calculus is complicated even further as it's slowly revealed that his motivation to align himself with the insects is not necessarily out of ideological support for their salvation, but simply because he can use them as a means to oppose and violently strike back at those who victimized him. All of his young life, as we know, Bug had been infected by a spasmodic political deviation from his peers. The insects are actually just resources to him, a means for him to achieve his goal of destroying the reactionaries. And this is pretty much how everyone treats each other in the book. How can they use one another to further their own individualistic goals? And Vollmann alludes to this in the very beginning by showing us in the social gazette of personalities who these characters are in reference to who they are in service of. This is one of my favorite characters, Frank Fairless. Frank Fairless. Double agent, darkroom technician, documentary slideshow producer, loser, tool of Dr. Dodger and the Blue Globes, aged 48 in year one, the reincarnation of Roger Garvey, at Bug's disposal. Everyone is a tool of someone else's or at someone else's disposal. We're all just resources to one another in this story. And this is effectively the bi-directional relationship between Bug and the insects. They're simply just using one another. Does Bug actually give a shit about them? We're not given much reason to think so. When looking at a vulnerable insect, a Bug remarks he felt sorry for it, in the easy way that we all have the pitying vulnerability when that pitying cost us nothing. And when presented with the opportunity to save an insect friend of his at summer camps from its tormentors, he sits by and watches passively as they tear it limb from limb. Bug's allegiance with the insects is simply a pragmatic decision to further his own self-serving motivation, to wreak havoc on those who did so to him. The victim, slowly, over the course of a long and discursive novel, becomes an aggressor himself. It's an incredible fuck you to the reader. We're primed to expect a classic picaresque redemption story, but instead we're just getting an agonizing fall from grace. It's beautiful and uncompromising in its exploration of indoctrination and dehumanization and cruelty at the service of ideology. And no one in this story is safe from Vollmann's scrutiny. There's a very particular moral calculus at play, and he's not taking sides on either end of this spectrum. The conflicts present in the world of Angels are effectively between the dichotomies of imperial expansion in the name of industry and indigenous resistance. All the characters that oppose one another in these conflicts can be seen as sort of avatars of larger socioeconomic concepts and influences in the colonial machine. One of the most significant characters in the novel, both narratively and thematically, is the protean Dr. Dodger. Here's his description from the Social Gazette of Personalities. Dr. Samuel William Dodger, aka Dr. William Samuel Dodger. Reactionary, inventor, lecturer, psychiatrist, small businessman, mail order and retail, senator, member ex officio of all city councils in our great republic, age 79 in year one, Mr. White's right-hand man, at Phil Blaker's disposal. Dr. Dodger is effectively the human embodiment of late-stage capitalism. The idea was conceived by Werner Sombart in the late 20th century, but it didn't really take hold as a concept, at least in the Western world, until the late 2010s, uncoincidentally after the GFC. The term refers to cultural attitudes toward the injustices and inequalities and exploitation at the hands of modern business development. In my previous video, I spent some time talking about what's known as the anti-work movement, which is effectively based out of this mindset. Pynchon addresses this idea head-on in Bleeding Edge when a character states, "Late capitalism is a pyramid racket on a global scale, getting the suckers to believe it's all going to go on forever." In recent years, there's been a lot of pseudo-intellectual think pieces that describe the way in which this word has been mutated and co-opted to be used in any context that refers to inequality and economic injustice. Regardless of how it's used today, remember this book was written in '87 before the term came into vogue. Much like the other giants of American literary fiction, DeLillo, Wallace, those types, Vollmann's just had his finger on the pulse of Western life since the get-go, culturally speaking. Like his contemporaries, Vollmann is a bit of a social anthropologist in the way that he takes character archetypes and uses them to explore broader socioeconomic and cultural phenomena. Dodger is effectively the perfect distillation of market violence left to grow and pervert the economic system present in the book. He operates as Mr. White's right-hand man and is a protean jack of all trades, intent on commodifying anything that can possibly have a dollar value ascribed to it. All throughout the book, we see the ways in which he positions himself as an inventor, a lobbyist, a strategist, and just general ideas man for the reactionary elite. Dr. Dodger had long since realized that the more inventions he produced, and town councils he sat on, and patients he treated, and students he taught, and businesses he ran, the less accountable he was, because it was very hard to keep up with him, and he could always argue that what was bad for one enterprise was good for another, in such a way as to improve the whole by some fractional amount. One of his key industrial products is a darkroom photo lab, which is described as the center of a technical revolution, its business procedures reflecting the impact of industrial capitalism. Many of the key players of the reactionary elite are employed at this photo lab, and this place acts as a sort of catalyst to much of the conflict that would occur in the second half of the book. Yet for all his alleged industriousness, Dr. Dodger turns out cheap new products all the time at the expense of longevity or quality. And if you're not familiar with this concept, you've clearly never bought one of these little bastards. Dr. Dodger's inventions are for short-term emergency use only, soon outworn by new frenetic capitalistic innovations or the sullen tide of free market goods. And besides, they bust pretty easy. The structures built by Dr. Dodger were really so much shabby cardboard, designed to give the tolerable illusion of solidity, like the painted backdrop to a theatrical performance, but they existed mainly because the audience paid to see the play. I talked at pretty reasonable length about the diseased state of capitalism in my previous video, and it appears that I share that perspective with Vollmann himself. When interviewed about his 2009 mammoth Imperial, Vollmann stated that the disease of capitalism is what drove Imperial County into destitution, as well as drive his motivation to write about it for 1,300 pages. But that was 2009, and this was 1987. What this shows is that this idea has tracked through the entirety of his career. He shares this skepticism and distrust of capitalism and our current economic system with other authors in the likes of DeLillo, Gaddis, Pynchon, and so on. And it's clear here that Vollmann had his sights set on the exploitation of the lower socioeconomic class since his debut novel. Nothing which he had a hand in ever went wrong as long as he was present at the demo show, for it was after the product had been sold and field tested once, and Dr. Dodger had been relieved of all liability, that bad things began to happen. Have you ever had an appliance die out on you just after the 2-year warranty timed out? Yeah, me too. Preemptive obsolescence may have just been a fancy set of terms in the 80s, but I assure you it's alive and well today. This idea is drawn further and to a more insidious end when we see the role that Dr. Dodger plays in the treatment of the insects captured by the reactionaries. There's a truly harrowing scene in which these insect prisoners of war are sentenced to death by hanging in a specially designed gallows created by, you guessed it, Dr. Dodger. Vollmann, having the truly sick and twisted sense of humor that he does, plays this scene for laughs. And these gallows that Dodger has patented malfunction just horribly, and the reactionaries just end up having to shoot the insects to death. It's a hilarious and just biting indictment of cheap and ubiquitous free market merchandise that's available as the result of capitalism writ large. Anything that can be packaged, marketed, and sold has Dr. Dodger's stamp of approval sealed across it in true free market fashion. He will produce anything for you, regardless of the moral or human cost, so long as the price is right. And this is part of why the reactionaries yield so much power, because they know exactly how to commodify themselves. And Dodger is the lens through which to view this reading of the book. Although we can't say for certain that capitalism is a product of colonialism or vice versa, they most definitely are inexorably intertwined with one another. And that's a point that Vollmann is hell-bent on making very clear in this book. When parsing through it yourself, I'd encourage you to keep our modern-day analogs in mind. I'm talking Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson. You will be alarmed and confronted by how prescient this messaging is today. I've given a lot of airtime at this point to the characters and conceit and structure of this novel, but we haven't really gotten to what You Bright and Risen Angels actually is about, what Vollmann set out to do with this novel. Of course, as an outsider looking in, I can only speculate on something as intimate as authorial intent. I'm going to give it the old college try, as it were. As I've hinted to already, it doesn't take a shrewd literary scholar to see this novel for what it is, a post-colonial allegory. If you take into account Vollmann's experiences with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan only a few years prior, it becomes quite clear that his preoccupations with power and persecution were informed by his experiences over there as a journalist at that time, as well as his helplessness to affect it any which way. By the time I finished writing the first version of An Afghanistan Picture Show, many more people in Afghanistan had been killed. I wanted to write the balance on paper, since I was impotent to do so anywhere else, by telling a story of a good extremist who triumphed over the bad guys. I made the bad guys as bad as I possibly could, and I made them oppress Bug himself so that he would unequivocally be in the right. But as soon as Bug began to strike back, he began to become evil, no matter what I did. There is one reading you could take away from this statement. Perhaps Big George, as both a character and a plot device, is sort of a manifestation of Vollmann's experiences of trying and ultimately failing to write Bug into a conclusion of righteous salvation. It's almost like Vollmann had a Big George of his own, staring over his shoulder and steering him away from the easy, happy, satisfying ending into a more misanthropic conclusion, for lack of a better word. And I don't necessarily use this term disparagingly. I simply read it as Vollmann trying to communicate a worldview that he had witnessed firsthand as both a journalist and a historian. In an interview with Michael Silverblatt on Bookworm, he stated that
people can always hope to do certain things, but the material residue of human history is bloodstains.
The material residue of human history is bloodstains. I'm venturing into reductive territory here, but I will be the first to say that history, particularly European colonial history, has always been a clash of opposing ideologies that almost always resolves itself through violence. And this is what we see in Angels with the hero, Bug, who believes that a violent means can be justified by an ideological end. But does Vollmann believe this? For my money, nada. The essay I found most broadly instructive with respect to Vollmann's authorial intent was Miles Leibtag's essay, Our Oriental Heritage, Seeking the Post-Colonial Postmodern in You Bright and Risen Angels. This essay was included in the William T. Vollmann Critical Companion, compiled by Christopher Kaufman and Daniel Lukes. I would be tempted to call this the most indispensable reader's guide to an author since Weisenberger's Gravity's Rainbow Companion or Stephen Moore's William Gaddis annotations. Jordan Rothacker, one of the hosts of the VOLLMANNIA podcast I mentioned up top, also penned an essay titled Piss, Lime, Vitriol, which is included in the companion. In his essay, Leibtag sets out to defend You Bright and Risen Angels as a lesser work in Vollmann's catalog, as well as position it as an exceptional satire of manifest destiny. Both Leibtag and I agree that the easy reading of this story would be to view it as a simple assimilation and resistance story. Good versus evil, reactionary versus revolutionary, Cowboys and Indians. In my reading, Vollmann's sympathies do not lie exclusively with the revolutionaries. It's just not the kind of novel that you can cleanly compartmentalize. Revolutionaries good, reactionaries bad. What Angels is in reality is a cautionary tale about the ways in which that dogmatism can corrupt a well-meaning resistance effort. Angels presents a valuable critique of dehumanizing ideologies and rejects the moral absolution of those ideologies on the grounds that they can be turned toward the ends of resistance or revolution. Far from being relativistic, Angels forces moral confrontations on all fronts and finds innocence only momentarily and contingently. Voltage, which can be harmless one day, may be fatal the next if atmospheric conditions are right. Context being everything, the novel says, we believe in undifferentiated cruelty to the hazard of our antic souls. Material circumstances matter, but so does empathy with the disenfranchised, the marginal, and the subaltern. Look, it might initially appear that Vollmann is sided with Bug, his alleged hero, and the revolutionaries, but if you adopt Liebtaug's critical valence, you realize and see him as actually rejecting both groups, because they each have their own individual dehumanizing treatment toward the insects. It's just packaged differently. The reactionaries enslave, torture, and kill the insects, sure, but Bug and the revolutionaries simply use them as a means to achieve their own violent end, regardless of the cost to life to them personally. They are the tools for him to wield in the pursuit of his dogmatic goal. In the end, it almost plays out as everyone versus the insects. If the marginal and oppressed are the objects of Vollmann's empathy, then one could make a reasonable case that his interests actually lie with the insects. This preoccupation with expansionist oppression would be the prototype which he would explore much further and much deeper in his Seven Dreams series. To those unfamiliar, the Seven Dreams sequence is a series of historical novels that focuses on the violent clashes between European settlers and the indigenous peoples of North America at different points throughout history. And he views these conflicts through the examination of landscape and the ways in which the landscape is changed and altered and corrupted with the expansion of industry. Years before he wrote the first dream, The Ice Shirt, we see him workshopping these ideas in Angels. Like I mentioned before, the first 130-odd pages are devoted to a sort of oral history of the formation, foundation, and proliferation of electricity. Vollmann presents this image of the untouched, pristine, indigenous American West, and then the arrival of the settlers, the dissemination of electricity, and the complete destruction and alteration and perversion of the natural landscape in the interest of industrial expansion. Nowadays, as one lounges out on the porch of an evening in a folding lawn chair of finished redwood, it is scarcely possible to recall the limitations of those days. It seems that our memory, typewriters, and compact disc players have been around forever, like wise, infinitely reliable mentors and administrators of our sport. Here we see Big George reclining on a lawn chair cut from the landscape from beautiful redwood trees and musing on the fact that our memory of the pre-colonial world has all but ceased to exist. Contemporary American society has been fed this myth that the American landscape prior to colonial settlement was an untouched, unsettled wilderness, which is just categorically false. It's part of a historical rhetoric that has been written and modified time and time again, as if you're part of a program that Big George had a hand in corrupting. Big George, pure electrical consciousness itself, could be viewed as the physical manifestation of colonial rhetoric, erasing, modifying, and altering our cultural memory, our program, our cartoon, the entire time that it was being written. You take for granted as you watch this video that the fiber optic cabling that runs from YouTube's data servers in California all the way to the laptop wherever you're watching it wasn't always there. Those wires were laid down at the expense of the natural landscape and the forcible removal of the people who were indigenous to that region at that time. Or, if you want to do away with the indigenous landscape allegory altogether, you can simply view these insects as an obstruction in the program running smoothly, a bug in the code. Coincidental pun? I call bullshit. In Angels, electricity is always placed in the relative position of power. Not the reactionaries, but electricity itself, and the blue globes that produce and control it. The globes allow themselves to be used by the reactionaries because their willful servitude provides them a means in which they can multiply and metastasize over the American landscape. How much clearer of an allegory do you need? The end goal of European imperialism has and always will be manifest destiny. The electricity was something quite other, and it was up to no good. So that as we constructed our grids and boosting stations and lines across the entire world, we increased its mobility and power. And someday, perhaps 100 years from now, when everything was electrified, then we would see the true face. In my reading, that face is not simply just the electrification that's contributing to our dying planet today, but also the ways in which that power is commodified. And Vollmann illustrates for us in no uncertain terms the horrific lengths that colonialism will go to serve a capitalistic outcome. A perfect example is the hundreds of thousands of ants that are boiled down to create toner so that the reactionaries can print their war propaganda and spread it through the cities. Meanwhile, the desks of the backroom secretaries, which had once resembled a noisy Asiatic bazaar in their show of print dresses and lipstick, the swapping of aspirin for cold sore pills, the exotic clickings of high-heeled shoes on the cement floor, which was stained with the formic acid of hundreds of thousands of ants, which had been boiled alive as prisoners of war to make sepia toner. Mr. White proliferates the electrification of America, and Dr. Dodger commodifies it. Colonialism and capitalism collide, all at the expense of the marginal and the oppressed. I mean, seriously, do you need it made any clearer? His company is literally called White Power. He's pretty much spoon-feeding the metaphor to you. Everyone in the novel, at almost every narrative level, is complicit in imperial aggression. Vollmann clarifies this idea at the end by revealing that the place from which the author is writing the program is actually inside the offices of the Society of Daniel, the headquarters of the reactionary movement. We see that Big George has locked the author in these abandoned offices and left him alone to write this program after everyone has already gone home. We bright and risen angels are all in our graves, as I, the author, can assure you, for Big George has locked me into the Society of Daniel for the sake of productivity. Instantaneously, Vollmann collapses the frame narrative into the nested cartoon, even inserting the story of how he wrote the novel and putting it all in a single narrative space. The author, Big George, Bug, Mr. White, Dr. Dodger, even possibly Vollmann himself, find themselves all situated together in this surreal reimagining of an electrified America. And now this wild, wild west bell jar places all the characters on a level playing field, implicating every last one of them in the colonization allegory. It's not you, bright and risen angels, it's we, bright and risen angels. Call it what you want. Simulation, allegory, cartoon, ethical laboratory. I call it a biting social critique that has no reservations against shining its accusatory lens back on itself. An author that's willing to show teeth. You've got to respect that. How did so many critics miss this? Nobody escapes this story without some degree of complicity, and Vollmann leaves the tale open-ended to show us that colonialism and imperial aggression are still an ongoing project, with many pages left to be written. This is the reason the novel is intentionally unfinished, at least in my interpretation of it. We see at the very beginning, in the transcendental table of contents, that the novel ends only halfway through its own story. We don't get any clear conclusion to the plot, only two conflicting promises about what will happen. One from the author, one from Big George. I know there will be some people that disagree with me, but I wish we could have seen those chapters actually come to life. I mean, seriously, you can't help but read some of these titles and be at least a little bit curious. Terror in Florida, Mating with the Great Beetle, The Exodus to Greenland, The Alabama Offensive, In the Mausoleum, The Fulfillment of All Intentions. There is so much incredible potential in this story that I would have loved to see him take it even further. It's not often that I say a 600-page book with this level of typeset density doesn't feel long enough. but I understand and respect his decision to leave it open-ended. Imperial expansion is far from complete, both in the book and the world in which it's being read. This gets to the heart of why I find Vollmann so goddamn fascinating. He can combine history, contemporary life, surreality, speculation, and fantasy, blend it all together and still come out with a cohesive story at the end of it. And in doing so, he forces you to examine your own relationship with the constructed reality that you live in. It's not your fault that we live in a colonial world, but it's damn sure your responsibility to take part in its correction. So long as there's an us and a them, whether it be Democrats and Republicans, reactionaries versus revolutionaries, or even humans and insects, we can't say in good conscience that we live in a post-colonial world. People have referred to Angels as the ugly duckling of his catalog, something of an outlier. While I do think this is an unfair characterization, I do recognize the distance between this and the rest of his work. Now, I'm not particularly well positioned to weigh in on this, as I've only read one other book of his, The Atlas, which I've been reading alongside of You Bright and Risen Angels. At the risk of sounding reductive, this is almost like a reader's digest of his work. It contains a lot of different formal and prose stylings that you would find all across his career. And it contains both shorter versions and excerpts that would be expanded into full-length books later on. The Rifles, Fathers and Crows, Butterfly Stories, even parts of Angels itself can be found in here. I've also started chipping away at Fathers and Crows as my first foray into the Seven Dreams series. So, of the bits and pieces that I have read of his other works, I do see a much more grounded, subdued style in his later writing when compared to the maximalist hysterical realism you would find in Angels. Maximalism and absurdity are clearly present here, and that calls for a very particular literary sensibility. For that reason, I'm not entirely surprised that readers of more conventional fiction bristled at its histrionics. But, in an exercise of being oppositional myself, I'd like to offer a few counter-arguments to some of the critiques I've seen written about it online. Vollmann has an ambition and imagination to fuel a metafictional army, but his overwriting, often cryptic and dense with tumbling 200-word sentences, leads the unwieldy enterprise into a swamp from which it never escapes. I normally like Kirkus, but this just didn't ring true to me. I think it's interesting that the author here refers to it as a swamp from which it never escapes. That reads to me like the words of someone who wanted a clear sense of closure, dispassionate toward whoever was the one to receive it. Reactionaries, revolutionaries, doesn't really care who wins so long as Vollmann puts a pin in the whole thing. What I think is they should have at least humored the possibility that the open ending was designed to depict the unfinished and ongoing state of colonial existence. People have said that Angel starts to fall apart around the second half, but that just wasn't my experience at all. He opens this world up wider and wider as he goes along, showing you how far the influence of imperial oppression stretch, a continent of expansionist control. And he doesn't tie the whole thing up neatly at a bow at the end. He forces you to take part in a participatory reading experience where you have to do some inferences as to how the hell this story actually did end. And I get why this might have been frustrating or disappointing for some people, but that's just the hallmark of really good quality literature that asks just as much from you as you do from it. And I don't remember anyone decrying Infinite Jest for doing exactly the same thing. So why take issue here? Here's another one from an acquaintance of mine. Reading the book's description would have made me excited to read the novel, but it seems that these events are rarely focused on or are touched on in such obtuse ways that I rarely understood the purpose of what I was reading. The cartoonish nature leaves the characters one-sided and did not allow me to engage in any form of empathy or compassion. This is from Byron's Glowing Filament on Twitter, someone whose feed I really do enjoy. And while they make a lot of really good points in this review, I wanted to push back on this idea a little bit. I see this particular criticism of character lobbed at Pynchon quite often. While not entirely ungrounded, I do think your perception of the characters will be filtered through a particular set of expectations. If you're coming into something like Angels or Gravity's Rainbow with the expectation of a stunningly vivid portrait of individual psychology and interior life, you're going to have those expectations crushed in the first 50 pages. It's just not that type of book. On the flip side, if your interest is in a systems novel that examines sociological and economic and political power structures across a broader society, that is exactly what you're in for in Angels. Both Vollmann and Pynchon focalize these big concepts through the medium of character, and that's what often can give them this caricatured or stilted feeling of one-sidedness. Let me call back to what Miles Leibtag had to say about this. Structural forces of late capitalism and its counter-movements, represented by symbolic aggregates like the all-powerful blue globes and the seemingly omniscient Great Beetle, interpolate and position agents according to each of their own needs, giving no ultimate preference to even such a remarkable agent as Thomas Edison, knowing that to do so would have been contrary to the laws of social development. Characters in You Bright and Risen Angels are typically avatars of market violence. He said it better than I ever could have. The characters in Angels may come off as exaggerated or caricatured, but that's because they act as a commentary on different belief systems, operating sort of as microcosms of broader societal attitudes. Mr. White exemplifies far-right fascist conservatism. Dr. Dodger represents free market capitalism run amok, and Bug is a distillation of a marginalized victimhood complex turned violent. They're all representations of a larger reality that Vollmann compresses into these little individual avatars and hypersaturates to histrionic effect. It's hysterical realism 101. And sure, he beats you over the head with his meaning once in a while, but he did warn you in the epigraph. Only the expert will realize that your exaggerations are really true. Plus, the novel is literally subtitled, A Cartoon. How about this one? When I tried to express my frustration to a classmate, saying that Vollmann seemed more interested in performing than getting his ideas across, and that if he wanted to perform, why not go into show business? She countered that I might be drawing a line between performance and theory that she felt was unnecessary. I like this one because he includes the counter-argument himself. So nice of you to do the work for me. I am a staunch believer in the idea that history is a subjective construction fed to you through the filter of political and ideological beliefs relative to where you were raised. You'd have to be incredibly naive to think that politics is somehow divorced from performance. And Angels is a profoundly political novel. It's not Vollmann's politics on display, but a melting pot of clashing dogmas that range from fascism to pacifism. Sure, the plot is wildly outlandish and absurd, but he's just following the footsteps of the satirists that preceded him. Gaddis, DeLillo, Pynchon, and so on. All they do is take touchstones of cultural and sociological relevance and crank the volume up. Personally, I've got all the time in the world for surreal maximalism provided that it actually has something to say. Performance is just what makes the theory actually fun to read. Look, Angels has been accused of being a lot of different things. Overwrought, masturbatory, messy, sloppy, boring, digressive. While I see the place where all these criticisms come from, they also strike me as the words of people who maybe lost patience for it partway through. I urge anyone who didn't finish it or gave up and started skimming to stop, go back to the beginning, and read it slowly. For my money, I think this is a brilliant first work of fiction filled with remarkable prose and makes some incredibly thought-provoking arguments about colonialism and the limits of resistance. So if you're thinking about picking it up for the first time or returning to it after a long gap, let me offer you some recommendations. You Bright and Risen Angels is a novel written for a very particular type of reader with a very clear set of expectations from the beginning. Here's my model for that reader. 1. You should already have a pre-established taste for absurdity and a reasonable comfort with the conventions of hysterical realism. 2. If you haven't read at least a few of the authors that I've mentioned in reference to Vollmann, I would encourage you to do so. You'll be doing yourself a favor. 3, you need to have a liking for maximalism and a reasonably high tolerance for digression. This is a fairly discursive novel. Vollmann will wander off from the main narrative for sometimes up to 50 pages at a time, with these sort of side threads that add wonderful texture to the story but may make you scratch your head a little bit as to what their direct narrative relevance is. And lastly, you need to have a stomach for violence and abuse, as these things are depicted in grim detail throughout this book. I absolutely recommend Miles Leibtag's essay, which I mentioned earlier, which provides such incredible depth and complexity to the reading of the book and makes an incredible case for it as a post-colonial allegory. The Vollmann Critical Companion is a fairly pricey piece of text, but the ebook is quite affordable. So if you're interested in doing that, I will link to it below where you can purchase it. I would also encourage you to watch Chris Villa's video on this same book. I'll put a link to it in the corner there. He provides a much more concise breakdown of the novel, which I think may be better suited to a new reader. The purpose of my video today is much more a kind of deep dive into people who already have some familiarity with Vollmann, or preferably this book as well. I'd also recommend tabbing the Personality Gazette and the chapters Synthetic Cognitions a priori and Station Identification, as I found myself repeatedly referencing them throughout the book. They've got a lot of thematic and narrative relevance that will be helpful for you to be able to flip back and forth to periodically. While I can see both sides of the argument, I think there is a strong case to be made for Angels as a starting point if you're new to Vollmann's work. No, I don't think it's broadly representative of his entire career with respect to structure and tone and prose. However, the concepts that he's exploring with this debut would provide the groundwork for an entire career of thematic and cultural concerns. Marginal oppression, the fallibility of resistance, the risks of ideology, capitalism as a corrupting force. All of these make up his thematic oeuvre, and you will find them in some degree in every single one of his books. And so something really appeals to me of having this as your primer going into his entire body of work. While it's far from perfect, I think You Bright and Risen Angels is a brilliant first novel and provides a wonderful entry into a long and deeply impactful literary and journalistic career. This may have been my first Vollmann, but I guarantee you it won't be my last. All right, another one done and dusted. That was a long one, so if you're still watching, gold star to you. You have the attention span worthy of a Vollmann novel. Despite the linear increase in episode length, the intention is not for these to get progressively longer with each subsequent video. I just happen to have a lot to say about this book, as did the people that I referenced in it. So on that note, all the secondary resources I drew from you'll be able to find in the description box below, as well as the links to supplementary materials that I would recommend you check out. As I said up top, you can find both a text transcript and an audio-only version of today's episode below if you want to engage with this in a slightly different medium. As always, I am very open to feedback. The more critical, the better, so please feel free to rip me to shreds in the comment section below. Or if you just enjoyed it, I'll take nice comments too. I think that's everything. See you next month, Paranoids. Holy shit. Did you know that Vollmann was on the suspects list for the Unabomber? And then after they cleared his name, he was also suspected of being the anthrax mailer. You can't make this shit up. Seriously, I'm going to link to it below here. God. Only Vollmann.